Strategy in chess is, in my opinion, the most fun, challenging, and rewarding element of playing the game. And I also think it's probably the most transferable skill into real life. Being able to employ strategic concepts is going to help you whether you're playing Mario Party minigames or in the world of work and business. These strategic concepts, as I say, very fun and rewarding and very useful in the real world. However, they are some of the most tricky to pin down and actually employ, particularly in chess. So in this video, what I wanted to go over was some broad definitions of what strategy is, what it's not, and some general examples of what strategy can be in a game of chess. And we'll end with an example game of a recent game I played where I was able to employ a strategy from pretty early on and turn the screw and win a pretty tricky game. So let's jump in. So broadly speaking, a strategy is a long-term plan of action where you use your assets and their capabilities to gain a competitive advantage. In chess, your assets are your pieces and your pawns, and their capabilities are the things that they can do, i.e. what squares they can control, what pieces they can attack or defend, etc. So chess is a game of coordinating your assets and making the most of their capabilities in order to overcome your opponent's army in some way. Now, obviously, your opponent is trying to do the exact same thing, so the victor will be determined by whose strategy makes more sense in the position and who can execute better. So you'll often hear chess commentators talk about the arguments that players are making during a game, and that's generally a question of strategy. For example, white may argue that the concession of a certain asset, say a pawn, may be worth the additional capabilities that their other pieces gain in exchange, say for example gaining a bishop pair playing against your opponent who only has a bishop and a knight. So those kind of strategic questions are often what they mean when they talk about the argument players are making. So where strategy differs from tactics is generally a question of scale. So we mentioned that strategy is a longer term plan. So when discussing strategy, you very often won't mention specific piece moves or operations, whereas tactics are a lot more concrete and literal, like what is going to happen in the next couple of moves. So let's take a look at two potential strategies, for example, to kind of clarify that. So one strategy might be to create an early barnstorming, swashbuckling attack where you mobilize your pieces and your assets as fast as possible to crash through your opponent's defenses and checkmate the king before they have time to consolidate and get safe. In doing so, you may forego some of your own defensive operations, or you may even sacrifice material to achieve this really, really quick smash mouth style of play. Inversely, you might also choose to just build a really compact, rock solid fortress that is very, very hard to break down, where all of your pieces are very well defended and they kind of talk to each other really well. And your plan might be to slowly improve your position, keep the game closed, and you might again try to kind of grind out some more position or more space for your pieces, as well as looking for opportunities to counterattack your opponent should they overextend their hand or be a little bit too brazen in their attack. In this case, you actually also run the risk of giving your opponent plenty of time to coordinate their army, and you may well get be boxed in if you play too passively and don't claim that space. You're too focused on defense. So notice how in both of those examples, the swashbuckling, barnstorming approach and the kind of rock solid turtle shell approach, I didn't actually mention any specific moves. I didn't really mention too many specific pieces, and that's because that's strategy is that much broader, conceptual principles rather than those specific operations. So also notice how both strategies have strengths and weaknesses and threats and opportunities available to them. And generally a game of chess is the balance of those factors and who can exploit that best. And that's generally what people talk about when they talk about the argument. My argument is that the factors are in my favor, and your argument is that actually I'm underestimating maybe the threats that you have against my position, etc., etc. And that's what strategy is. It's like setting out your stall for a broad strokes approach to the game, rather than being like, I'm going to pin your knight and then I'm going to try to attack it with another piece, and hopefully you won't figure it out or something like that. That's not a strategic operation. It can be a tactical operation, and if you play your strategy right. Oftentimes, your strategy, if played well, will make such good use of your assets and their capabilities that tactical opportunities will actually just arise naturally as a result. Now, you need to practice tactics to be able to recognize those, but generally, when you use a coherent strategy, your pieces will be so coordinated that those tactics will arise quite naturally. So let's check out a recent game of mine with a strong strategic theme to help visualize some of these concepts. So this is a recent rapid game of mine that I played in the 17-1800 rating range. So my opponent's 1744, I was 1834 at the time. And I think what was interesting about this game was I didn't actually get a chance to play my usual preparation. I actually don't know this opening, not particularly familiar. I was looking to play a King's Indian or a Grunfeld, but neither happened. I wasn't really aware of this bishop move, which I think was a good thing. It got me out of autopilot. It got me to actually look at the position and understand what assets and what capabilities I had. So within 3 moves, already out of my depth, but that's okay. That's fine. That's going to happen. It's going to happen to everybody. Chess has many openings. And immediately after they took my knight there, I thought that was a funny move. I thought it just stood out to me a little bit as unique, or that's probably being kind. I thought it was a bad move because immediately doing our calculation of assets and capabilities, they're giving me their dark squared bishop for a knight. Now, at the top level, this is not the top level, generally players will favour a bishop over a knight because bishops do a very specific thing. Dark square bishop controls the dark squares, light square bishop controls the light squares, whereas knights are quite interchangeable and they don't necessarily have a monopoly on a type of squares like bishops do. It's a very slight advantage, but an advantage all the same. And as soon as they give me that dark square bishop, I know that I have a dark square bishop and they don't. So not quite a strategy just yet, but I just file that away in the back of my head. I say, generally, I do not want to give up my dark square bishop anymore because they don't have one. That's something that I can do that they can't, is control a diagonal of dark squares without using my queen. So that's just one capability I have that they don't. File that away. They push their pawn here, which again, not a great move, but nothing again crystallizing in terms of a strategy. Just move my knight out of the way. And not every move I make is going to be in line with this strategy, and maybe not every move that you'll make will be too, because sometimes you just have to put out fires, you have to defend your pieces, move your pieces. But Garry Kasparov has a great quote from his masterclass. I think Tartakower said it initially, where tactics are what you do when there's something to do, and strategy is what you do when there's nothing to do, which I think is a nice, like, cutesy way to think about strategy. Is if you're not sure what to do, think about what your strategy is, think about what moves might fit into that broader plan. So with that in mind, we actually do make a strategic move in here. Computer doesn't like it, but the computer's a nerd. So I just move up a6 here. It's a funny looking move. You might be thinking, okay, well, yeah, I guess you're keeping the knight out of here, but what's the knight doing in there? The actual reason I wanted to make this move is because I wanted to put my bishop on this long diagonal. Again, with that concept in mind of I can control long diagonals, they can't. I wanted to move this pawn because oftentimes when you put your bishop here, you'll often find this knight can move here. So with the bishop on this square, knight's hitting it, and bishop actually can't drop back here. You just have to drop back, and that's a total waste of a move, because if you're getting attacked and you don't want to make that trade. So I wanted to make this little cubby for my bishop for future reference. Just again, a nice little capability that we can drop the bishop back there should we need to. So we just file that away for future reference. And now our opponent's next move, e4. Again, the computer thinks that this is the best move, but with all that we just filed away about the long diagonal and the dark squares, immediately that sort of crystallizes my strategy. I want to attack this long diagonal with my pieces. I want to amass my forces to hit largely this f2 pawn, but also just more broadly the dark squares on my opponent's king side. That's the strategy. When I get a moment and when I don't have bigger fish to fry or more tactical operations, my play is going to be dictated towards doing that. I have a focus. It is something that I can kind of, if I need to make choices, I'm going to make choices that lead me towards that goal of attacking that f2 square and in general the dark squares on the king side. So We put our bishop on the long diagonal. Happy days. It is very, very happy here, particularly with the little cubby hole. And we've started our strategic operation of hammering on to the dark squares on the king side. Now we're going to do all the normal stuff. We're going to get the rest of our army involved, because a strategy is not going to be executed by one piece. You do need your whole army, but you can have pivotal and central pieces to that strategy and more superfluous, expendable pieces, let's say. Our knight being one of those, we're happy to make that trade for a knight if they want to spend a tempo moving their knight twice to take out a good knight of ours, but it wasn't the headline act, let's say. So now we have this absolutely beautiful pawn chain and this absolutely beautiful bishop, which they don't have a great way of attacking at all in any sort of meaningful way. They develop their bishop, we get castle, we get safe again. No need to rush at this stage. We do have this already competitive advantage, and the computer thinks so too. We're +1, nothing massive, but enough to eke out a bit of a change. We move our queen onto the dark squares on the king side, again knowing it's going to be pretty tricky for them to oust us. And even more specifically, if we look at this knight is garbage as far as it comes to defending maybe the light squares or the dark squares on the king side. It would take a couple of moves for him to have any sort of efficacy on that side of the board. And now we see that the knight has done that threatening operation that I mentioned, where we can start to maybe cut off some of the squares for the bishop, and bishop can't go here because of the queen. But thankfully, old Muggins over here made himself a little cubby hole, so we're just going to drop the bishop back, and now that bishop is so safe and sound in there, and forevermore going to be putting the squeeze here on f2. And now, to be fair, White, I think they had a decent argument here. They wanted to kind of cut off the bishop here. They kind of lose the thread a little later on, because this was kind of an annoying problem for us to solve. Not insurmountable, but annoying. We finish off our minor piece development. Computer didn't like this as well. They thought it was time for us to open up the position, and in this case the computer was right, despite being a nerd. And now we actually do get to open up the position. We play f5. Again, my argument at this stage is I'm ready to crack this open. My pieces are where they need to be, all of them ready to jump into the action, and I think that I've coordinated my assets to the best of their capabilities, and I'm ready to kind of crack in on the king side. Now again, this blocks off my bishop, and this was a problem for us to solve. Again, not insurmountable. There was certain things we could have done, but it would have taken us a few moves to solve this problem and get our bishop back into the lording position it was in, if our opponent didn't completely brain it and open up our bishop for us, which I was delighted with. And this isn't really a threat, or this isn't really doing much. We have all manner of ways to solve the problem that this pawn poses. First one, threaten checkmate. Always a good way to create a bit of urgency. Actually, this wins an exchange straight off the bat, so not too shabby. So a nice blunder there for our opponent did help us out. But the broader context was we did have all of these strategic assets that maybe not necessarily led to the blunder, but they certainly left us in a position to take massive advantage of this. So we win the exchange. Actually, we don't even bother take because we can threaten this knight with a bit of tempo, like nobody wants to lose a knight for a pawn, free up our bishop to get her back in the saddle, and we still have this threat. They still have just too many things to solve. So again, this is the argument that I'm making is that I've just utilized my pieces well enough that there's too much for you to solve, and you haven't really made any threats on me, so I have plenty of time to turn the screw, as it were. So the knight comes back in, again just gets himself out of dodge, but it's far too late. We take the rook, because why not? And finally our bishop actually does something, because previously it was just making threats, but now the bishop defends this rook, which crashes in on the king side. And honestly, at this stage the game is over. The computer has us at minus 13, so 13 in our favour, which is overwhelming. The king's defences are kaput, foobar, if you will. We're just going to win the game from here because of the assets that we have left. And the rest of this is kind of shuffly and probably not the best, but the larger point is we've just amassed all of our remaining assets, which is a whole piece more, or an exchange and a couple of pawns more than our opponent has. And we're just in absolute dominant position. We have still have this glorious bishop providing support here, but now we have these doubled rooks. We have a king that has pretty much butt naked back here, and this one is going to wrap up pretty quickly. And our opponent actually resigns at this stage. And again, the matter of finishing this game, you know, we could even potentially look at things like bringing the rook in here, sacrificing the rook and crashing through, because you just have too much of your assets focused on one part of the board. So all of this spawned, and again, I'm not saying that this was a perfect strategy or anything like this, but it's an example of a strategy where early doors my opponent made a certain concession, a certain argument, which was a bit of damage to my structure, a bit of very superficial damage to my pawn structure for a bishop knight trade, which I was like, okay, that's fine, that's your argument. My argument is that the dark square bishop is going to be worth much more, and I'm going to make it worth much more. I'm going to make the most of its capabilities. And they did help us along quite a bit, but they didn't know our strategy. They didn't think they were helping us, and that's a big point. Is your opponent can see your moves and everything like that, and at the top level they probably will guess your strategy, but they don't know what I'm planning. They don't know my broader, like, immediately they're not thinking, oh, this f2 pawn's weak, I better do everything I can to defend it. But I'm thinking that f2 pawn's weak, they should do everything they can to defend it, because of the difference, the imbalance in the position. And the rest, as I say, is history. At the cubbyhole, I was delighted the cubbyhole came into practice. But overall, our strategy was control the dark squares, attack the king side, amass our pieces on the king side, and take advantage of the fact that they can't defend their dark squares. That was the enduring advantage that we had, and it led to mistakes. Like, again, our opponent didn't play terribly. They made a couple of big mistakes that generally led to this bishop having a greater life. But overall, they played fine. They played okay, but they just got blown out of it because we had this focused strategy. All our moves were very efficiently targeted at that pawn and at that side of the board, which just led us to use our capabilities better. So that is a whistle-stop 101 tour of strategy in chess. Hopefully that has crystallized a couple of concepts for you, and hopefully you can start to see why it is so fun and so rewarding to hatch a plan like this and have it play out and have you draw fruit. And I promise it will. And I think one of the main benefits is how much it focuses your play. If you have an overarching strategy in mind, when you don't know what to do, you can play a strategic move. And I guarantee if you do so effectively, it will lead to these crushing positions, because your opponents probably aren't going to be playing like this with a focus in mind, with a cohesion of their assets like this. So that's going to be all from me today, folks. If you did have a good time, feel free to like and subscribe, stick around, comment any other kind of topics you'd like me to cover off like this, and enjoy your chess. All the best. Thank you.